Hello everybody. Today I'm going to be reviewing with you Unit 3, which is Cultural Patterns and Processes. While I go through this, I recommend that you have your Unit 3 notes with you in front of you so you can kind of flip through, and if you want to add anything you can do that. That way you can have a good reference. So I'm going to go through the order in which the College Board curriculum is organized. And so topic 3.1 is the introduction to culture. So it's just understanding what is the meaning of culture and what makes up culture. So characteristics, attitudes, traits, all these things we look at when we study culture. You actually, when we introduced this unit, you had made a list and the class went through and everybody in the class listed a culture trait. So it's what we see. That's the obvious part, how people dress. But it goes well beyond that. It's also people's attitudes. And so geographers are interested in studying culture because it helps us understand people around the world. Now there's two ways that people kind of view other cultures, and so we're going to break that down into, one of them is ethnocentrism. If you break it down, it's like centrism is central, centric. This is where people believe that their own ethnic group or their own culture group is superior to other cultures. So it's kind of like judging other cultures based on your own. And it's kind of a form of bias where we just immediately assume that if someone else is different, then that they will, perhaps their culture is wrong. So this example here is just about, a lot of times it's food, like the belief in certain food is better than other types of food. So kind of the opposite of that is the idea of cultural relativism. And this is when people kind of view other cultures in, not necessarily, it's relative. So cultural beliefs are relative. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to act or believe, and so it's kind of looking at other cultures with a more open mind. I don't know if you remember looking at this picture here, and this is an example of architecture in Hong Kong, and we asked the question, why are there holes in the buildings? Well, based on beliefs of that region, the idea of feng shui, of the movement of energy, they would construct buildings in a particular way for the flow of that energy. So if you were to look at this in the eyes of ethnocentrism, we would say, that's weird, that's wrong, why did they do that? Whereas if you look at it through the eyes of cultural relativism, you may think, okay, well that's interesting, and just kind of accept other people's beliefs without necessarily judging them. This is also an example of a cultural landscape. So topic 3.2 is cultural landscapes. This is the definition: the visible imprint of human activity and culture on the landscape. The layers of buildings, forms, and artifacts sequentially imprinted on the landscape by the activities of various human occupants. And so this was created by a geographer named Carl Sauer. So I'm going to go over and talk about what makes up the cultural landscape. Think of it as kind of what you see in the environment of a place. So cultural landscapes are the combination of several characteristics. So not only is it going to be the physical landscape, but it's going to be also agricultural and industrial practices. So it could be how people farm. So we talked about agriculture. There's commercial agriculture. You may have rows and rows of the same crop. Well, that is part of the cultural landscape. It could be that terrace agriculture we see in mountainous regions, like we see a lot in Southeast Asia. Okay, that's an example of a cultural landscape. We also see that it's the religious and linguistic characteristics of a place. So not only will you see it necessarily in the architecture of the religious buildings found in a location, but maybe even cemeteries and burial practices, that kind of thing. Linguistic characteristics, that means language. You see this a lot with the toponyms. Remember, toponyms are place names. The signage throughout an area is very revealing of the culture of a place, because it obviously tells about the language, but it also can reveal the history of a place, because you can see, well, how did that language get brought there? Who originally settled? Or was it multiple groups, and do you see multiple languages? Another part of a cultural landscape is this evidence of what's called sequent occupants. Sequent occupants is the idea that there's several layers of history in a place. And so as one group in particular lives in an area, they may leave their cultural imprint. Another group comes in and they're going to leave their cultural imprint. And then it's layered on. So the history of San Antonio is a good example. We're over around 300 years old, and you can see the many layers of the different groups of people that have lived in San Antonio, and the evidence in the buildings, the architecture, and the evidence of the language, of the religion practiced within this city. So sequent occupants is just those layers of people occupying a place over time. So you obviously see it in architecture, land use patterns, so how we organize space. So in San Antonio, we have, the downtown area, we have highways, we have railroads that all kind of meet in the middle, and then we have, a lot of residential areas, and the way houses are spaced out, the way houses are organized. You get to the suburbs, we have like the yards with the fences and all of that. That is an example of the cultural landscape. If you go to other places, you'll notice that maybe it's a little bit different. A little side story, when I was a little kid, I lived in Florida, and when I lived there until I was about 10 and moved to San Antonio. And one of the things that stood out to me was that everybody had like these wooden fences around their yards, around their backyards. That's not something that I saw very often when I lived in Florida. People just didn't have fences in a lot of cases. So all those are examples of cultural landscape. Here's a couple pictures I took when I went to Rome. So a couple things that just this one little area, this one little block, can reveal about maybe the culture of the area. Well, historically in Rome, people like to show off their wealth. In this case, they built this fancy fountain, which is now a tourist attraction. But you can see, the Roman architecture, the ancient influence there. And then right next to it, there's a place where they sell gelato. So you can give away, the cultural landscape as far as what people like to consume, what people like to eat. Part of understanding the cultural landscape is understanding how you need to explain how landscape features and land and resource use reflect cultural beliefs and identities. So by looking at the cultural landscape, looking at that built up environment from humans, you can learn a lot about a place. So these are pictures from San Antonio's west side. If you've never been to San Antonio's west side, I suggest you drive through. You're going to see lots of murals all over the place. And so you obviously can see some of those cultural imprints, the Spanish language. And the murals oftentimes depict perhaps daily life, but also you can see, the bakeries is something that people want to eat at. And you can see somebody working on their car here. So just you can learn about an area based on the cultural landscape, and it's going to reflect their beliefs and identities. Even how people say things. So this does turn out. So this is showing you different ways that people say. This is different toponyms and how we would use the word stream, because not everybody uses the word stream. So different parts of the United States reflect that they use different words. So they can use branch or run or fork or brook. Over here in like Louisiana area, they say bayou. That is evidence of the French influence. So the cultural landscape is influenced by areas that, whoever settled in that area, obviously. I'm going to go over a case study. So here we have Canada, and the map is showing you the population that speaks English at home. And you can see the darker the red, the more English speakers, but then you can see that one place stands out, and that is the province of Quebec. Okay, so Quebec was actually the first place settled by people who came in and settled, aside from the Native Americans who were already there, but the French came in. And eventually the British came in and took over. And in Quebec, they maintain their French heritage and their French language. So in Quebec, they actually speak French. They work to maintain that French heritage to make sure that French doesn't get overtaken by the more dominant language of English. So they actually have laws in place that say, the government must operate in French, public documents, road signs, they should be in French. Now, English is also going to be present because it is the main language of the entire country of Canada, but French kind of has like the first priority, and then English will be there as well. So they're still very bilingual, but they choose to maintain that French heritage and French language. And I don't know what this sign says. I don't know French. So we want to talk about how cultural traits spread, and so we need to understand the different types of diffusion. So cultural diffusion is just the spread of cultural traits, okay, across areas. So this is very geographic. And there's two types of diffusion. There's expansion diffusion, which is when something spreads outward, so kind of like multiplies. So the people possibly stay in one place, but the idea does the moving. And there's three types, and we're going to talk about that. And then there's relocation diffusion, which is when a person gets up and moves and spreads an idea through the physical movement of a person. So it's not necessarily multiplying, it's just one person's here and they move across the world and now it's there. So an example of that is you'll find that like Hinduism is an ethnic religion, and ethnic religions don't really try to spread or try to get people to convert. So if you see, for example, Hinduism practiced in somewhere besides India, that is because of relocation diffusion. Somebody from India had moved to somewhere else and then now practice their religion in another place. Now the types of expansion diffusion are these listed here. And you should have notes that we went over some examples and videos and things like this. So should be a review of all of that. So contagious diffusion. This is rapid, widespread diffusion, like a contagion, okay? In fact, the current pandemic would be an example of contagious diffusion. Viral videos, when we talk cultural, viral videos are, anybody has access to these things and it can spread from person to person. So you find something cool and you share it with your friend and then they share it with their friend and then it kind of multiplies. Hierarchical diffusion, if you think of a hierarchy, you have the higher authority on top and then going down to maybe places or people that are less important. So a person or place of power, and then those ideas, they'll spread to, less significant people. So fashion is a good example of hierarchical diffusion. So big time fashion locations like New York, LA, Paris, places in Europe, Italy. So they begin in these more important places when it comes to fashion and then spreads to eventually maybe like a smaller town. Stimulus diffusion is taking a cultural trait but adapting it to your own culture. So the best example we always like to talk about is McDonald's. Okay, McDonald's is worldwide, but their menus are not the same worldwide. They're adapted to the culture of the place. So here's an illustration that we did as a warm-up actually. And I wanted you to look at this and try to figure out what kind of diffusion is represented in each of these little pictures. So I'm going to not talk for a few seconds and want you to think about what kind of diffusion do you see? So let's look at A. You have a culture trait, a group of people, they move to another place, and because of that, it's not multiplying, that's relocation. If you look at B, person or place of more importance or higher authority, and then a culture trait will spread then to the next level, and the next level, next level. It's hierarchical. Letter C, you could see everything's connected to each other. This is contagious diffusion. And D is stimulus, because you see the little dotted line. Things are going to change a little bit, and that's what that means. So how is it that culture traits spread? What are those historical causes of diffusion? And so historically, colonialism, imperialism, and trade are three main factors that would lead to culture change and lead to the spread of cultural characteristics. So colonialism and imperialism tend to be a more dominant group spreading their culture. Trade is going to be happening everywhere throughout the world, so you definitely see a lot of diffusion due to trade. Migration would be another example of a historical cause of diffusion. So that leads to, well, how do certain languages become dominant in areas? Well, colonization is going to play a big role in that. So I'm going to show you a couple examples. This was the Spanish Empire at one point. Okay, so you can see all the areas that are colored red. If you see those places today, you will still see evidence of the Spanish influence. And very obvious in some of these countries, it's still the main language. In some countries, it's still maybe a minority language. But the Spanish Empire definitely influenced the culture traits of the places, not only in terms of language, but also religion. So if you see what's in red, you'll still see Roman Catholicism is a very dominant religion. The British is kind of the same concept. So the British Empire at one point, now this is by the time we were free, but if you look at former British Empire, you'll also see the English language may be a dominant language in these parts of the world. So in modern times, ideas are going to spread through different means because colonialism, imperialism, those things aren't really happening anymore. This is kind of what's happening now. As people move from the country to the city, they're going to pick up new culture traits or maybe bring them with relocation diffusion. Globalization, the world is becoming smaller. We are more and more connected. We definitely see more dominant countries influencing other parts of the world. Now, on the activity I gave y'all with the culture case studies, one of them was like the 5 most influential countries on culture. And so you can kind of see the different cultural characteristics that some countries play in the worldwide culture. Of course, because of time-space convergence, because we are more and more connected, because of modern communication and modern transportation, we're going to see things diffuse at a much more rapid rate than they would have historically. So cultures are starting to really, really converge. And as a result of that, you may start to see more dominant cultures becoming more popular and less dominant cultures kind of being left behind. And this especially is seen with languages that are minority languages that are maybe being dropped, where people are adopting the more dominant language. And we did case studies on languages, so I suggest you go through yours. So we need to understand, when it comes to religion and language with this unit, we don't need to know the characteristics of religions. What we want to know is the diffusion of them. You know, where did they begin and where did they spread to? So a hearth is the origins of a culture trait. So in this case, these are the hearths of religions and then where they subsequently spread. So you have a map that should be very similar to this that you would have colored on your own, or something that would have arrows like this. So I don't have the whole world on here, but you can still see, you know, the origins of certain ones. So here we have Christianity, that's the gray. This is also where Judaism began, but that is an ethnic religion where they don't seek followers. So you don't really see it spreading as a result of trying to get people to convert. It's really through relocation diffusion. So you can see Christianity spreads into Europe. Now eventually the Roman Empire is going to make that religion very dominant. It's the official religion. And then later on in history, Europeans are going to go colonize all over the world and bring Christianity with them, which explains why Christianity is the most widespread religion in the world and the most practiced religion in the world. And then also close by in the Middle East is the origins of Islam, and through types of diffusion such as migration, we start to see the spread of Islam into North Africa, into this whole region we call the Middle East. And through trade, we find it reaching what we call Central Asia. And also through warfare, we see the spread of religion. So the spread of Islam down here into Southeast Asia would be through trade. So the religions that began in South Asia that are dominant religions today are Hinduism and Buddhism. So Hinduism began in India, and pretty much you don't see it spread much further out. And you do see some Hinduism practice in Southeast Asia, but otherwise it'd be through relocation diffusion. And then Buddhism is a universalizing religion. So Islam, Christianity, Buddhism are universalizing. They actively seek converts, so therefore more and more people will convert to the religion, and it'll spread faster. So Buddhism spread especially eastward into the East Asian countries like China, Japan, and the Koreas. If you look at this map here, this is the majority religion by country, so you can get an idea of, you know, in that country, most people practice this particular religion. That doesn't mean that there's no other religions practiced. It's just this is the majority one. So China is a communist country, so they kind of call themselves atheist, technically, because they want people to dedicate themselves to their country and not necessarily a religion. But there are actually a lot of different religions practiced within China. Buddhism would be a common one as well. Here we have a map showing you some world languages. Now, it's actually way more complex than this to understand the world language map, but this gives you an idea of some of those major language families. Once again, historical causes of diffusion are going to create this pattern that we see today. So if you look at the Indo-European, which is what we speak as an Indo-European language, there's different subfamilies. That's what these are, subfamilies. And for example, like the Romance languages is the languages spoken by the former Roman Empire, and, you know, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese. So whenever those places would go settle in another area, they would bring with them their particular language, and so that's why you see Romance languages here. English is a Germanic language, so it was brought over to the United States because the British colonized here first and eventually become the dominant power, and English spreads throughout. That's what this means. So topic 3.8 is the effects of diffusion. Explain how the process of diffusion results in changes to the cultural landscape. There are some terms that I wanted to go over, and this would be in your notes as well: acculturation, assimilation, syncretism, and multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is just, you break it down, many cultures. And the United States is a great example of a country that embraces multiculturalism. Okay, we don't really have an official language. Yes, English is the dominant language, but many, many languages are spoken here. Many religions are practiced here. You know, many different types of food. So that's multiculturalism. And because of a lot of people moving to the United States and bringing their culture with them, we see that our country is more multicultural. Countries that limit immigration and historically have limited immigration tend to be more monocultural, where they have very much the same culture. So historically speaking, and even now, there's different ways that cultures can change. So acculturation is when a group adopts some of the traits of another culture. So let's say somebody's going to move to the United States. English is the dominant language, and so for people to be able to function better in an American society, perhaps they learn English. That doesn't mean they drop their old language though. So that's acculturation, kind of like adapting to the new place that you are in. Assimilation, the root word there is same. And in this case, a group will drop all of their old ways, maybe their language, their dress, etc., and adopt the new dominant language and dress and culture. And so that, a lot of the times in history, has been more kind of forced upon people. So when the Native Americans were maybe put into boarding schools and they had to wear Western style clothes and they had to speak English and then drop their old culture, that would be assimilation. And we talked about an example of that, and that's what this video clip is. I think this was a clip from Greenland, which is a province of, or a territory of Denmark, where they took people from Greenland and made them learn Danish and drop their old culture and adopt the Danish culture. And the last thing I'm going to cover today is the word syncretism. So a lot of times it's not so simple as like you just have one culture and that's it. There's going to be lots of blending of cultural traits and ideas from different places and different times. And so the example I have here is Buddhism. So Buddhism started in India and mainly spread eastward, along trade routes into China, into Japan, into Southeast Asia. And so Buddhism is very much like a religious belief that can be highly adapted to other belief systems. And even in the image of the Buddha, you can see this concept of syncretism. So this is 3 different ways that Buddha is depicted. And the far right is actually kind of like the original Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism. He fasted. He was very thin because of fasting. So you'll see him depicted as, very skeletal looking. But that is very opposite of this guy, who we also call the Buddha. He's the laughing Buddha. He's not the historical founder of Buddhism. This is Hotai, but he's still called a Buddha. And here's another depiction of the Buddha. So it gives you an idea of how these have blended with other cultures and kind of adapted for their own use. Okay, so that was a quick run through of culture review. I suggest you go through the College Board reviews as well and let me know if you have any questions.